Storytelling. Most people move into a neighborhood expecting comfort, privacy, and a sense of belonging. But for one homeowner, the simple act of stepping outside his door felt like entering a battlefield he never signed up for. Anonymous complaints slipped into his mailbox, strange photos taken from the shadows, board members circling his property long after sunset. None of it made sense at first. What began as a harmless misunderstanding slowly twisted into something darker, something calculated, something that threatened to break the peace he once believed was guaranteed. And when the HOA tried to force him into a rule he never agreed to, the truth burst open, revealing a web of manipulation that no one, not even his neighbors, were prepared for. This is the moment when a quiet homeowner
Storytelling. Before anything went wrong, life in the community felt almost deceptively calm. The homeowner, someone who never asked for trouble, never looked for conflicts, and rarely paid attention to the politics of neighborhood life, had chosen this place for one reason: stability. The streets were quiet, the lawns were manicured, and the houses stood in neat, predictable rows. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened. A place where people kept to themselves, shared polite nods at the mailbox, and pretended the world outside the community gates didn't exist. For months, he settled into a rhythm that felt reassuring. He woke early, enjoyed long mornings on his porch, took care of his property, and occasionally chatted with neighbors who wandered by with their dogs or weekend lawn tools. It wasn't a perfect neighborhood, but it felt safe, structured in a way that made life feel manageable. And for someone who worked long hours and valued quiet evenings, the steady simplicity was exactly what he needed. But even in those early weeks, there were small signs that something beneath the surface wasn't quite as peaceful as it appeared. The same neighbors who smiled during the day whispered to each other at night. The HOA board members, easily identifiable by their matching clipboards and stiff, purposeful walks, made rounds around the neighborhood with a level of seriousness that felt excessive for a community of suburban homes. Rules were mentioned often, casually slipped into conversations that didn't require them. Comments about standards, consistency, and maintaining the image of the community came up far more than one would expect from ordinary residents.
Still, he didn't think much of it. After all, every community had quirks, and every HOA had a few overly involved board members who took their roles a little too seriously. He focused on his own home, making small improvements when he could, keeping things clean and presentable. Nothing he did ever seemed out of place, and no one ever approached him with concerns, so he assumed he was fitting in just fine. What he didn't realize was that certain people in the neighborhood had already taken notice of him, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he was new, unfamiliar, and not part of the quiet, insular loop that had dictated the community's rhythm for years. The HOA president, in particular, had a reputation he hadn't yet learned about. Someone who operated the neighborhood like a personal kingdom, where every mailbox, garden bed, and porch light was monitored with obsessive precision. Most residents complied simply to avoid confrontation, but a few resented the constant surveillance and veiled threats. They whispered warnings, though never loud enough to reach him. As weeks passed, small interactions began to shift. A neighbor who once offered friendly waves started giving him curious, lingering looks. Another asked oddly specific questions about his plans for the property, as if searching for something to report. A board member approached him one morning and made an unnecessary comment about staying aware of community expectations, phrased in a way that didn't sound like casual advice. Even his mailbox seemed more crowded with flyers and reminders than anyone else's. He brushed it off. Maybe they were just trying to be involved. Maybe they were simply cautious with new residents. He had no reason to expect conflict, no reason to think that the house he bought for peace and stability would become the center of a storm. But then came the first sign that something was changing.
It was subtle, the kind of detail most people would overlook. A note tucked under his doormat, not official, not typed, just handwritten in hurried, sharp strokes. It didn't accuse him of anything, but it hinted at violations, concerns, and necessary cooperation. There was no name, no signature, and no explanation of what he'd supposedly done wrong. It felt less like a warning and more like a test, a way to see how he would react. He slipped the note into a drawer and moved on with his day. Yet an uneasy feeling settled in, difficult to shake off. The neighborhood that once seemed still and predictable now felt like a place where eyes watched from behind curtains, where people measured each other quietly, where the smallest deviation could become a topic of board discussion. What he didn't know was that the HOA had already begun discussing him in private. His home, his yard, his recent arrival, it all became the subject of whispered speculation. The president in particular saw his independence as a challenge, something that didn't align with the tightly controlled system she'd built. And without him realizing it, she had already decided he would either fall in line or become a problem to handle. In the days that followed, that tension, still invisible to him, but growing, was about to reveal itself in the most intrusive way possible. Because the note wasn't the beginning of the conflict, it was merely the first crack in the surface of a neighborhood about to turn against him.
The first real shift came slowly, quiet enough that it almost blended into the background, but sharp enough to leave a mark each time it happened. It began with a letter in his mailbox, this time printed, stamped, and clearly issued by the HOA. The tone was clinical, but the message cut straight through any illusion of neighborly goodwill. You are in violation of community standards. Immediate correction required. No explanation, no detail. Just an accusation designed to unsettle. And it worked. He reread it several times, trying to imagine what could possibly be wrong. His lawn was trimmed, his porch was clean, his trash bins were stored properly. There was nothing out of place, nothing that justified a vague, almost threatening notice. But the letter wasn't a mistake. It was the beginning of a pattern. 2 days later, another notice arrived, this time referencing improper maintenance of his side yard, an area he had checked just the day before and found to be perfectly fine. A week after that, he received a warning about the placement of his garden hose, then an urgent reminder about keeping his windows clear of unauthorized coverings, despite the fact that he had never changed the blinds that came with the home. Each notice grew more specific, more accusatory, and more unreasonable. None contained photographs or evidence. All came with the same underlying message: you are being watched. At first, he tried to respond calmly. He sent an email requesting clarification, asking politely for any specific concerns they might have. Days passed with no reply. Eventually, he approached one of the board members during their evening rounds. The man barely looked up from his clipboard, mumbling something about just following protocol, refusing to elaborate. The encounter left him with more questions than answers.
Storytelling. But the worst part wasn't the notices. It was the feeling of being monitored. He started noticing the HOA president walking past his property multiple times a day. Sometimes she paused, pretending to examine something on her clipboard. Other times, she stared directly at his house, her eyes scanning every inch like she was hunting for evidence. At night, he would see shadows lingering near the edge of his yard, neighbors who suddenly seemed very interested in his comings and goings. Conversations around him stopped abruptly whenever he approached. People whispered as he walked by. The atmosphere shifted from cold politeness to open scrutiny. Then the fines began. The first was small, a penalty for yard obstruction, referring to a single foldable chair that had been there since the day he moved in. The second was for garbage bin placement, issued on a day when he hadn't even taken the bins out. The third was for unauthorized exterior modifications, claiming he had altered the color of his front door, which he hadn't touched. Each fine arrived with increasing aggression, each one adding pressure. What had once been a peaceful routine was now overshadowed by constant stress. He considered attending an HOA meeting to clear things up, hoping face-to-face communication might help. What he didn't expect was how the meeting would unravel. The board members sat in a semicircle, clipboards in hand, looking more like a tribunal than a neighborhood committee. The president presided over everything with an air of authority that bordered on theatrical. When he asked about the notices and fines, she responded with rehearsed politeness, but her words were coated with condescension. She listed vague infractions, none of which were documented, and dismissed his questions with phrases like community expectations and upholding standards. Every attempt he made to defend himself was cut short or redirected.
But the worst part wasn't the notices. It was the feeling of being monitored. He started noticing the HOA president walking past his property multiple times a day. Sometimes she paused, pretending to examine something on her clipboard. Other times, she stared directly at his house, her eyes scanning every inch like she was hunting for evidence. At night, he would see shadows lingering near the edge of his yard. Neighbors who suddenly seemed very interested in his comings and goings. Conversations around him stopped abruptly whenever he approached. People whispered as he walked by. The atmosphere shifted from cold politeness to open scrutiny. Then, the fines began. The first was small, a penalty for yard obstruction, referring to a single foldable chair that had been there since the day he moved in. The second was for garbage bin placement, issued on a day when he hadn't even taken the bins out. The third was for unauthorized exterior modifications, claiming he had altered the color of his front door, which he hadn't touched. Each fine arrived with increasing aggression, each one adding pressure. What had once been a peaceful routine was now overshadowed by constant stress. He considered attending an HOA meeting to clear things up, hoping face-to-face communication might help. What he didn't expect was how the meeting would unravel. The board members sat in a semicircle, clipboards in hand, looking more like a tribunal than a neighborhood committee. The president presided over everything with an air of authority that bordered on theatrical. When he asked about the notices and fines, she responded with rehearsed politeness, but her words were coated with condescension. She listed vague infractions, none of which were documented, and dismissed his questions with phrases like community expectations and upholding standards. Every attempt he made to defend himself was cut short or redirected. It didn't take long for him to realize they weren't interested in hearing him. They were interested in controlling him. The other residents at the meeting either avoided eye contact or watched him with thinly veiled amusement, as if they were witnessing a familiar spectacle. Some had been on the receiving end of the HOA's obsession before. Others were too afraid to get involved. By the time he left, his frustration had grown into something deeper, a simmering resolve to protect himself from whatever this was becoming. But the HOA wasn't done. Soon the harassment reached a new level. He found footprint trails in the soft dirt near his backyard fence. Human prints, not animals. His motion lights flickered on at odd hours, catching brief glimpses of movement before going dark again. One morning he discovered his security camera slightly tilted away from its usual angle, as though someone had tried to avoid being caught on video. Even small items around his yard seemed disturbed, subtly shifted from where he'd left them. Nothing was stolen, nothing was damaged, but everything felt touched. Then came the most unsettling notice yet: a violation for unapproved guests. He stared at the letter in disbelief. He lived alone. No one had visited him in weeks. The accusation wasn't just wrong, it was deliberately fabricated. It suggested that the HOA was not just watching him, but crafting a narrative to justify their escalating behavior. And if they could invent guests, what else could they invent? He realized that this wasn't incompetence or overly strict rule enforcement. It was targeted.
Someone had decided he didn't belong. Someone wanted him pressured, cornered, maybe even pushed out. The tension inside him grew heavier each day. He triple-checked his locks at night. He repositioned his cameras. He started documenting every notice, every fine, every suspicious incident. If they were building a case,
he would build his own. But the pressure didn't ease. It intensified. A week later, he came home to find a group of HOA board members standing on his property. Not near it, on it. They were measuring the distance between his driveway and the hedge line, arguing among themselves as if preparing to cite him for yet another invented violation. When he confronted them, they barely acknowledged him. The president turned with a tight smile and informed him that they were conducting an urgent property review. She refused to explain why. That night, the stress finally broke through his patience. He knew he had done nothing wrong, yet the HOA was acting like he was a threat to their precious order. It wasn't normal, it wasn't fair, and it definitely wasn't going to stop on its own. But before he could decide on his next move, the harassment took a turn that left him reeling. He woke one morning to find a large envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a stack of papers, more notices, more fines, more accusations. But the final page was different.
The storytelling letter stated that failure to comply could result in daily fines, legal action, and additional measures at the discretion of the board. It was outrageous, invasive, and completely outside the bounds of their authority. No HOA had the right to demand entry into someone's home. Yet, here it was, printed in bold text, as if his refusal would prove their suspicions. He felt a sharp chill run through him. Not fear, but something colder, something that hollowed out his frustration and replaced it with clarity. This wasn't simply about rules. This was about power. This was about control. And they didn't think he would fight back. That night, as he sat at his kitchen table surrounded by stacks of notices, emails, and fines, he realized the situation had escalated beyond harassment. It was strategic, coordinated, and if he didn't push back, it would only get worse. He began researching every rule, every statute, and every state law governing HOAs. He combed through his community's bylaws line by line, cross-checking each demand against legal requirements. The deeper he looked, the more he found cracks, clues that the HOA president had overstepped her authority for years, that she had been enforcing rules selectively, targeting certain residents while protecting others, manipulating votes, and maintaining power through fear and confusion. And then he found something else, something that made everything click into place. A clause buried deep in the HOA's founding documents, one the board clearly hoped no one would ever read closely. A clause that, if interpreted correctly, could unravel everything the president had built. A clause that made one thing painfully clear. The HOA wasn't just acting unethically, they were acting illegally, and they had no idea he had discovered it. As he gathered his documents, preparing for the next confrontation, one question lingered in his mind, a question that would soon define the rest of his fight. If the HOA had pushed him this far, what would they do when they realized he was pushing back? The answer would come sooner than he expected, and when it did, the entire neighborhood would feel the impact. The breaking point arrived on a morning that felt heavy before he even stepped outside. One of those strange, still days when the air is thick enough to warn you that something is about to snap. He opened his front door expecting another routine annoyance, another envelope taped carelessly to the frame. Instead, he found 3 people standing on his property. The HOA president, flanked by 2 board members, clipboards in hand and faces twisted with the kind of smug confidence that came from believing they could do whatever they wanted. They weren't there to talk. They were there to enforce. Without greeting him,
Without a single pretense of civility, the president announced that they were conducting a mandatory compliance inspection and needed immediate access to his home. When he refused, calmly, firmly, citing his legal rights, the president's expression hardened. She stepped forward as if claiming the land she stood on. Her voice rose, sharp and theatrical, loud enough for nearby houses to hear. She accused him of hiding unapproved renovations. She accused him of intentionally obstructing HOA operations. She accused him of creating a hostile environment simply by questioning their authority. It didn't matter that none of it was true. What mattered was the spectacle. A few residents drifted onto porches, pretending to water plants or check mail while clearly listening. This wasn't a meeting. This was a performance, one staged to intimidate him and validate the board's power. But instead of caving, he stood silently, letting her rant until her voice cracked from the sheer force of her own rhetoric. The more she talked, the more obvious her desperation became. But she wasn't finished. When he declined a second time to grant access to his home, she stepped back, lifted her phone, and made a call loud enough for everyone to hear. She was reporting him for suspicious activity and refusal to comply with neighborhood safety checks.
He felt the words hit like a punch, not because they were true, but because of the terrible familiarity of the tactic. It was the nuclear option for HOA bullies. Weaponized law enforcement, hoping fear would do what fabricated fines couldn't. Neighbors gasped. Some retreated indoors, others edged closer, drawn to the unfolding scene. Within minutes, a patrol car turned onto the street. Sirens off, lights off, slow, deliberate. The HOA president straightened her posture triumphantly, crossing her arms like a general welcoming reinforcements. She greeted the officer with exaggerated relief, pointing back at him with breathless urgency as though she had just saved the neighborhood from a looming threat. The officer approached cautiously, assessing the scene. The president launched into a rapid-fire explanation, layering false claims with emotional embellishment. He had refused inspections. He had been erratic. He had been uncooperative. He might have unsafe modifications inside his home. She painted him as dangerous, unpredictable, a problem that needed to be contained. It was the final escalation, the moment designed to break him. But the officer didn't react the way the president expected. Instead, he asked calm, direct questions, questions she couldn't answer, questions that required evidence she didn't have. Her confidence faltered for the first time as she stumbled through excuses, her voice thinning with each incomplete explanation. And then came the turning point.
He pulled out the folder he had prepared, thick with documentation. Copies of every notice, every fine, every email he had sent requesting clarification. Photographs with timestamps disproving their claims. Video recordings showing board members entering his property uninvited. Records of bylaws and state statutes they had violated. And finally, the clause, the buried, forgotten line in the HOA's founding documents that made everything they had done not just unethical, but illegal. The officer took his time reviewing each page, moving back and forth between the papers and the visibly panicking president. Her voice grew frantic as she tried to explain away each violation, each overreach, each manipulation. The board members behind her exchanged uneasy glances, shifting their weight as their certainty crumbled. When the officer finally looked up, his expression was unmistakable. The HOA wasn't the victim. They were the problem. He calmly informed the president that she had grossly exceeded the authority granted to her under state law. The board's demands, fines, and property intrusions were unlawful. The forced inspection request was a violation of privacy rights. The misuse of emergency services, calling police under false pretenses, was a serious offense.
Her face drained of color as the officer warned her that further harassment could lead to formal complaints, penalties, even charges.
But the real blow came when he turned to the board members and asked whether they were aware of the clause in their bylaws requiring annual reaffirmation of the HOA's authority. Their silence answered for them. The clause required a member-wide vote every year to maintain legal standing. That vote had not taken place, not just this year, but for several years, which meant something astounding. The HOA had legally dissolved itself without knowing it. Every fine, every notice, every intimidation tactic, they all carried zero legal weight. The president's voice shook as she tried to deny it, flipping through papers, desperately searching for some forgotten document that would validate her power. But there was nothing. Her legal foundation had crumbled. The audience around them watched in stunned silence as years of unchecked authority collapsed in real time. The officer stepped back and told him, quietly, but loud enough for the crowd to hear, that he had every right to file complaints against the board, every right to seek restitution, every right to hold them accountable. And he wasn't done.
He informed the president that knowingly enforcing non-existent authority could result in investigation by the state agency overseeing HOAs. Her expression flickered from outrage to dread. The neighbors watching seemed frozen between shock and relief, many of them realizing for the first time how much fear they had lived under. But the climax wasn't just legal. It was emotional. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, he felt the balance of power shift, not in a quiet, subtle way, but like a door slamming shut on the old order. The president's grip on the community had shattered. The neighbors, once silent, looked at her differently now. Some whispered, some stepped away, some shook their heads with a mixture of disbelief and long-suppressed satisfaction. The president tried one final attempt to salvage control. She stepped toward him, raised her voice, and declared that he was still required to comply with existing rules, rules she no longer had the authority to enforce. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. He simply handed the officer the final document in his folder, a formal notice of his intent to petition for a full audit of the HOA's operations, financial records, and election procedures. The officer nodded, recognizing exactly what it meant. The board members paled. The president's composure cracked completely. For a moment, everything was silent. The power that had dominated the neighborhood for years stood exposed, hollow, and defeated. The officer ended the encounter with a directive. The HOA was to cease all actions against him immediately. Any further contact needed to go through official channels, and only after the board verified their legal standing.
The president opened her mouth to protest, but the officer stepped away, ending the conversation. Neighbors drifted back into their homes, murmuring behind closed doors. Board members exchanged quiet, frantic whispers before retreating. He remained on his porch, watching the remnants of their authority scatter like dust in the wind. And as the patrol car rolled down the street, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Control. This wasn't the end. Not yet. The fallout was only beginning, because now that the truth was out, the entire neighborhood would have to face the consequences.
The next morning, the impact of the confrontation became impossible to ignore. An email from the HOA board landed in the inbox of every resident. It was brief, tense, and carefully worded, acknowledging that administrative discrepancies had been discovered and that all current enforcement actions were temporarily suspended pending an internal review. It was the first official crack in the facade, a quiet admission of chaos behind the scenes. Some residents were confused, others were relieved,
and a few were angry, their frustrations surfacing after years of quietly enduring the president's overreach. He received another email shortly after, this time from a board member who had remained largely silent throughout the ordeal. The message was short, almost anxious. "We need to talk, privately." It was the first sign of internal fractures, board members turning on one another, seeking distance from the president before the fallout caught up with them. But he wasn't interested in secret conversations. The next step needed transparency. He spent the following days submitting formal complaints to the state agency responsible for overseeing homeowners associations. Each document was thorough, supported by detailed evidence and clear timelines. He included photographs, emails, dated notices, and a full explanation of the illegal clause the HOA had ignored. He also requested a full audit of the HOA's finances, something no resident had dared to do in years. If the president had been willing to abuse her power so openly, he wondered what she might have done behind the scenes. By the end of the week, he received confirmation that an investigator had been assigned to his case. And that's when the real unraveling began.
Storytelling. One by one, neighbors started approaching him, slowly at first, then more boldly as they realized the president's power was no longer absolute. Some shared stories of similar harassment, petty fines or unannounced inspections. Others admitted they had paid fines they didn't agree with simply to avoid trouble. A few confessed they had voted for the president in past elections because they believed they had no other choice. The truth became clearer with each conversation. The community had been living under quiet coercion for years, and the president had thrived on that fear. With the support of these residents, he organized a meeting, an unofficial gathering held on a quiet corner of the community park. Dozens showed up. They talked. They shared experiences. They listened as he explained the bylaws, the illegal clause, and the consequences of the president's actions. By the end of the meeting, residents who had once felt powerless were discussing possibilities. Removing the board, electing new leadership, rewriting outdated rules, and restoring the HOA's original purpose. Supporting the community, not controlling it. For the first time, people began to imagine a different neighborhood, and the president could feel her influence slipping away. Behind the scenes, she scrambled to regain control. She sent out long emails filled with excuses, claiming she had acted in the best interest of the community and had been misled by incomplete records. She tried to frame herself as a victim of confusion, someone who had simply made mistakes while trying to maintain order. But the residents were no longer willing to accept her narrative. They had seen the truth. They had felt the weight of her control, and they had witnessed her unravel in front of a police officer. Everything had changed. The final blow came 3 weeks later when the state investigator completed the preliminary findings. The report detailed numerous violations: unauthorized fines, fabricated notices, improper inspections, selective enforcement, and a complete failure to uphold mandatory procedural requirements. The investigator formally recommended immediate suspension of the HOA board pending a full audit. The president fought the decision bitterly, but it didn't matter. The law was no longer on her side, and the community no longer sheltered her authority. Within days, she resigned, followed by 2 board members who had quietly benefited from her leadership. The HOA, once a towering source of fear, effectively dissolved in the aftermath, leaving only a skeleton structure that residents were now eager to rebuild.
The storytelling didn't happen overnight, but change became inevitable. A temporary committee was formed, made up of residents who genuinely cared about improving the neighborhood, not controlling it. They hosted open forums, encouraged feedback, and worked with legal advisors to rewrite the community's bylaws. They removed ambiguous clauses, eliminated unnecessary rules, and created clear processes to prevent future abuse. For the first time, the neighborhood operated on mutual respect rather than intimidation. And through it all, he remained involved, not as a leader, not as the center of the tension, but as someone who refused to let the neighborhood slip back into its former patterns.
He helped others understand their rights. He attended meetings not out of obligation, but out of a desire to ensure the community didn't fall into the hands of another authoritarian figure. He became a quiet source of stability, the kind of presence that made others feel safer simply by being there. As the months passed, the atmosphere of the neighborhood changed in ways that were almost tangible. Conversations at mailboxes no longer hushed when someone approached. Neighbors stopped walking with tense shoulders. People gathered more freely, offering help, sharing stories, or just enjoying the simplicity of coexistence. The community that once felt like a closed system of watchful eyes and rigid rules slowly opened itself to something better. One evening, months after everything had settled, he sat on his porch, this time without tension or caution. The air was still, the sky dimming as the sun lowered behind the rooftops. The same neighbor who had once nodded to him during those early days of uncertainty approached with a small basket of homemade bread. She thanked him quietly for what he had done, acknowledging that without him, the neighborhood would still be living under fear. He didn't feel like a hero.
He felt like someone who had simply refused to be pushed out of his own home. But as he looked around at the peaceful street, the laughter of children in nearby yards, the warm lights glowing behind windows, the sense of calm that had been absent for so long, he realized the impact ran deeper than he expected. What had started as a personal battle had become a turning point for the entire community. People who had once lived quietly under scrutiny were now free to reclaim their lives. The HOA would eventually rebuild, this time under leadership chosen through fair votes and transparent communication. Rules would exist, but they would be reasonable, focused on safety rather than control. The chaos that had defined the neighborhood for years became a cautionary tale residents passed down, a reminder of how easily power could distort ordinary life. And as for the president, she moved away quietly, without ceremony or support. She left behind a legacy of fear, but also a stark lesson in accountability. In the end, the conflict didn't just dissolve the HOA, it dissolved the illusion that silence keeps communities safe. It showed what happens when one person decides to push back, not with anger, not with revenge, but with truth. It proved that even the most oppressive systems can collapse under their own weight when someone finally stands firm.
Storytelling. As he leaned back in his chair, listening to the soft hum of an evening free from tension, one thought lingered, a question that would echo across the neighborhood for years to come. What would have happened if he hadn't fought back? And perhaps more importantly, how many others are still living in communities where no one has dared to?
Storytelling. In the end, the battle that was meant to overwhelm him became the turning point that reshaped everything around him. The lies collapsed, the intimidation ended, and the system built on silence finally crumbled under the weight of accountability. His stand didn't just protect his home. It protected every neighbor who had quietly endured the same fear but never felt brave enough to speak. Now the community walks with clearer eyes, stronger voices, and a newfound understanding of how quickly peace can disappear when no one pays attention. And as he closes this chapter of his life, he carries a lasting reminder. Sometimes the greatest change begins with a single person refusing to bend. If you've ever faced an HOA that pushed too far or witnessed a neighbor bullied by those in power, this story is your proof. Your voice matters, and your stand might be the one that finally turns everything around.